Picture the thermometer dropping past -50. Picture a road that simply ends, buried under snow, leading nowhere for months at a time. Now, picture this. In some of these places, help means waiting days for a plane that might never take off. This isn't a story about extreme weather. Winter here is just the thing that makes something else visible, something colder and a lot older, because every place on this list exists for a reason. Someone, a government, a company, an empire, put people here, and then, when they were no longer useful, walked away. The cold didn't do that. People did. The cold just makes it impossible to look away. This is a countdown through the most isolated, frozen communities in Canada. And the closer we get to number 1, the less this becomes a story about geography, and the more it becomes a story about who gets remembered and who gets left to face the Canadian winter alone. Start here, in the places so remote that roads simply never arrived, and never will. There are towns across the Canadian North where the only way in, the only way out, is a small aircraft. No highway connects them to anywhere else. Not in summer, not in winter, not ever. For decades, these communities were sustained by trading posts, by fur economies, by a brief flicker of usefulness to someone far away. Supplies came by plane, or, if the timing was right, over a winter ice road that existed for maybe 6 weeks a year if the weather cooperated. Then the ice roads got shorter. Climate shifted the calendar, and the windows for cheap ground transport began closing earlier each year. What's left is a population doing math that shouldn't have to be done, calculating whether a flight to the nearest hospital, a flight that might cost more than a used car, is worth taking for a toothache, or whether it can wait. It can't always wait. These aren't isolated incidents. They're the daily condition of life in dozens of communities, scattered across a map that from a distance looks empty, but isn't. And the deeper we go, the more these gaps stop looking like accidents. Somewhere further north, there's a settlement built around a single building, a weather station, or a radar post, or a refueling stop for aircraft that don't fly that route anymore. It was placed there with purpose: Cold War strategy, Arctic sovereignty, scientific monitoring. For a while, it mattered. People were stationed there. Supply ships came. It had a function. Then the strategy changed. The technology became automated or obsolete, or simply not worth the cost of maintaining staff in one of the most expensive places on Earth to keep a person alive. The station stayed. A handful of people stayed with it. Families who'd put down roots in soil that was never meant to hold permanent life, in a place chosen for logistics, not for living. Now winter arrives the same way it always has. But the supply runs are less frequent. The maintenance budget is smaller. And the people who remain are maintaining the memory of a purpose that no longer exists, in a place that was never supposed to be a home and somehow became one anyway. Every cold region in Canada has at least one of these: a town built fast around a mine, a smelter, a vein of ore that someone, somewhere, decided was worth the cost of building infrastructure in the Arctic or subarctic. For a few decades, it worked. Houses went up, a school, a rink, maybe even a movie theater. Proof that someone believed this place had a future. And then the ore ran out, or the price dropped, or a corporate decision made an ocean away decided it wasn't worth it anymore. The company left first, then the people who could afford to. What's left is smaller every year, a population in steady decline, living among buildings sized for a town 3 or 4 times its current population. The school still runs, but with fewer kids each September. The rink still floods every winter, mostly out of habit. Walk through in January, and you'll see houses with smoke coming from some chimneys and not from others. It's not always clear from the outside which ones still have someone living inside. There's a place where summer access comes by water, a short shipping season, weeks long, when barges bring in everything a community needs to survive the rest of the year: fuel, food, building materials, vehicles. Then the water freezes and the barges stop. For months, This place is functionally an island in a sea of snow, accessible only by air, and only when the weather allows. If the summer barge missed something, a part, a shipment, a piece of equipment that broke down in October, there is no way to get it until spring. People learn to live with absence. They learn to repair things that anywhere else would just get replaced. They learn which problems can wait 6 months and which ones can't. And every year, there's a quiet gamble. Did we order enough? Did we plan well enough? Because out here, a mistake in July becomes a crisis in January, and there's no one coming to fix it until the ice breaks. During wartime, military planners looked at the map of the Canadian North and saw strategic value, a place to build an air base, a radar line, a defense installation meant to watch the skies for threats that, in the end, never came the way they were expected to. Towns sprang up around these installations. Workers, families, support staff, entire communities built around a military purpose with an expiry date nobody mentioned out loud. Then, the threat assessment changed. The base downsized or closed outright. The military moved on to newer technology, newer strategic priorities, newer parts of the map. The town didn't move on. It couldn't. These were people's homes by then, not just postings. So they stayed, in housing built to military specifications for a population that no longer matched the buildings around them. The base infrastructure slowly decayed. Hangars with broken windows, runways that planes rarely use, barracks repurposed, badly, into civilian housing. It's a town shaped like its old purpose, worn by a population that's smaller and colder, and waiting for someone to decide what happens next. Somewhere in this list is the community that holds, or once held, Canada's official cold temperature record. The kind of number that gets repeated in trivia questions and weather documentaries. Minus 60-something. The kind of cold where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where vehicles need to stay running or risk not starting again for days. For a moment, that record put this place on the map. News crews came. A plaque went up, maybe. People learned the name of a community they'd never heard before, and then the news cycle moved on. But the cold didn't. The plaque is still there, technically. So is the cold. What's different is that the world's attention has gone elsewhere, while the people living with that record-breaking cold every winter are still doing it. With the same roads, the same services, the same isolation they had before anyone was paying attention. A record like that should mean something. Recognition, investment, at least curiosity. Mostly, it just means a slightly more interesting answer to, where are you from? This is where the curiosity starts running out. From here, the cold stops being the headline and becomes the backdrop for something harder to look at. There are communities in this list, and you'll notice this becomes a pattern, where the drinking water has been under a boil water advisory for years. Not weeks, not months, years, sometimes stretching past a decade, sometimes longer than some residents have been alive. In winter, this becomes its own crisis. Pipes that exist at all are often inadequate for the climate, freezing solid for stretches at a time. Water has to be trucked in, or melted from snow, or boiled, always boiled, before anyone can drink it, cook with it, bathe a child in it. Government reports acknowledge the advisories. Funding gets announced, timelines get set, and then quietly extended. Meanwhile, winter arrives the same way it always has, indifferent to bureaucratic timelines, indifferent to promises made in capital cities thousands of kilometers south. The infrastructure that southern Canadian cities take for granted, water that's simply, reliably safe, has never existed here. Not as an emergency, as a baseline. In community after community, there's a version of the same story. A road was proposed decades ago that would connect an isolated settlement to the regional highway network. Studies were done, costs were estimated, sometimes construction even began, and then it stopped. Funding was redirected, priorities shifted. The project was quietly shelved, sometimes without anyone telling the community directly. They just noticed the surveying crews stopped coming back. What remains, in some cases, is a stretch of road that goes part way and then simply ends. Gravel turning to brush. A literal monument to an infrastructure promise that someone, somewhere, decided wasn't worth finishing. Without that road, winter access depends entirely on ice roads, temporary routes built each year over frozen lakes and rivers, here for a few weeks and then gone. Climate change has been shortening that window year over year. The promised road that never came is now needed more than ever, on a timeline that keeps shrinking. Decades ago, in several parts of the Canadian Arctic, the federal government relocated entire Indigenous communities, sometimes framed as humanitarian assistance, sometimes as a way to assert sovereignty over remote territory during the Cold War, by placing citizens there. Families were moved hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 kilometers from their home territories, to locations chosen for strategic or administrative convenience, not for their suitability for the people being sent there. Promises were made about housing, about game, about support that would follow. Some of those promises were kept. Many weren't. Generations later, descendants of those relocated families still live in these communities, places their families never chose, dealing with infrastructure gaps, isolation, and a colder, harsher environment than the one their ancestors had lived in for generations before the move. It took decades, in some cases, for formal apologies to be issued. The apologies came. The isolation didn't go anywhere. There's something almost backwards about a place where winter makes things easier. But for several communities on this list, that's the reality. In summer, the surrounding land is wetland, muskeg, soft and impassable. The only way in by ground is when everything freezes solid enough to drive on. Winter roads, built fresh each year over frozen ground and ice, become for a few weeks the only affordable way to bring in heavy goods. Building materials, vehicles, bulk fuel, anything too large or heavy to fly in economically. If that window is short, or if a thaw arrives early, the consequences ripple for the entire year. A late winter road season can mean a community goes without a fuel delivery it was counting on, meaning costlier emergency air freight or rationing through the coldest months of the year. The frozen ground is infrastructure here. It's just infrastructure that's disappearing year by year as the climate changes, and nothing has been built to replace it. In a few places, there's a strange limbo, a community that the government has, in various studies and reports, identified as economically unsustainable, too small, too remote, too expensive to service, but has never formally closed or relocated. So it exists in a kind of administrative shadow. Major infrastructure investment stopped years ago. The school might still be open, but barely. The health center might be a single nurse, present a few days a week with anything serious requiring, again, a flight that depends on weather no one controls. People stay because it's home, because leaving means giving up a place their families have lived for generations, because the alternative, moving to a city where the cost of living is higher and the connection to the land is gone, isn't really a choice at all for many. Winter in a place like this isn't just cold. It's a test, repeated every year, of whether a government will choose to remember that people still live here, or continue to quietly let the question answer itself. Some Indigenous communities on this list sit on a fraction of the territory their ancestors once used freely. Land that supported hunting, fishing, and travel routes across vast distances. Now fragmented by resource development, hydroelectric projects, or protected areas that, ironically, restrict the very people whose presence shaped that land for thousands of years. Winter travel routes that connected communities for generations, routes used for trade, for family visits, for accessing hunting grounds, have been cut by infrastructure built for industries that, in many cases, didn't hire locally and didn't share the benefits. What's left is a community more isolated than it was a century ago, not because the land got farther away, but because access to it became someone else's decision. The cold hasn't changed. What's changed is who gets to move freely through it. On paper, this place still exists, a population number on a census, a dot on some maps. In practice, it's closer to empty than full. The people who remain are mostly older, mostly long-term residents who've watched everyone younger leave for opportunities that don't exist locally, and won't without investment that hasn't come and likely won't. Buildings stand empty, not abandoned exactly, just unused, too expensive to demolish, too remote to renovate, too far gone to sell. In winter, snow piles against doors no one opens anymore. Smoke rises from fewer and fewer chimneys each year. This isn't decline from a single event on a closed mine, a canceled project. It's slower than that. It's the decline that happens when a place is allowed to become not worth the cost of maintaining, quietly, gradually, without anyone ever announcing the decision out loud. For a small number of communities, almost all of them indigenous, almost all of them in the north, government policy has at various points effectively treated relocation or evacuation as the long-term solution to the costs of servicing a remote population, rather than investing in the infrastructure that would let people stay. Flooding, erosion, permafrost thaw, all of these have been cited as reasons certain communities may eventually become unviable. And in some cases, residents have spent years moving between temporary housing in distant cities and a home community that the government has, in effect, stopped fully investing in. Because why invest in a place that might not exist in 20 years? The result is a kind of slow-motion displacement, not a single dramatic relocation, like decades past, but a drawn-out uncertainty, where an entire community lives without knowing whether the place they call home will still be considered worth saving by the time winter forces the question. Treaties exist. Documents signed by representatives of the Crown outlining commitments to healthcare, to education, to infrastructure, to a standard of living that wouldn't fall below what other Canadians could expect. In some of the coldest, most isolated communities in this country, those documents are decades old, and many of the commitments inside them remain, by the government's own later admissions, unfulfilled. This isn't a story about a single broken promise. It's about an accumulation. Healthcare facilities that were never built to the standard promised, housing that was never delivered in the quantities needed, infrastructure investments that were approved on paper and then never followed through. Every winter that passes is another year these communities live with the gap between what was promised, on paper, with signatures, and what actually arrived. The cold doesn't check the paperwork. It just arrives, the same as always, into homes and communities that are still waiting for documents written generations ago to mean something. And then there's the last one. A place so remote, so small, so thinly documented that even finding reliable current information about it is difficult. Population estimates that vary wildly depending on the source, infrastructure details that are outdated by years, official maps that show roads or services that may not actually be there anymore, if they ever were. This isn't a place that was forgotten in some dramatic, sudden way. It's a place that seems to have slipped, slowly, out of the systems that are supposed to track where Canadians live and what they need, until what's left is barely a footnote. A name on a map that fewer and fewer official documents bother to update. People live here. That much is certain. What's less certain is whether anyone outside this community could tell you, with confidence, what their winter actually looks like right now. What they have, what they don't, what they're waiting for. And maybe that's the real ending of this list. Not the coldest place, not the most extreme temperature, but the place that's gone quiet enough, for long enough, that the rest of the country has stopped asking. The cold didn't do that. It just made it easier not to notice.